Hello, everyone. Hello, the amoral philosophers. We're back here with my friend Dima Jivov. It's the Amoral Philosopher YouTube channel, and we're talking here about philosophy of religion. This is our next episode. The previous one was dedicated to the introduction of Kalam cosmological argument for God's existence. So if you haven't seen the previous episode, I encourage you to go back and see that one first, because that's where we laid out the groundwork for today's discussion. There are some points that we won't be repeating today, and today we'll focus on the critiques against the argument. So it'll be very helpful for you to have seen that previous episode. So that said, I just wanted to, for those of you who might have forgotten the structure of the argument, I just want to share the screen with you momentarily. And on there, you will see the, Dima, can you see this now, by the way? Perfect. So hopefully our viewers can see that too. I'll just bring up the very first slide where we have the structure of the argument with the two premises and the conclusion. So just to recap, so the first premise says if the physical universe began to exist, then it was caused to exist by something else. Then the second premise suggests that the physical universe did begin to exist. And from that, we make the conclusion that the physical universe was caused to exist by something else. And in addition, there is a way that the argument suggests that the conclusion should be interpreted so that that something else must be God and as an entity having certain properties. So today we'll just begin discussing the objections against this argument. And as you can imagine, there are plenty of them in the literature, and we had some we actually spent quite some time with Dima yesterday going over the multitude of these objections and deciding which of them we want to focus. And so the result of that discussion was that it would perhaps make sense to break up this discussion into several shorter episodes to make it easier for you to see. And so the structure that we suggest to follow would be like this. So today we'll take a look at the objections against the first premise of the argument. In the next episode, we'll take a look at the objections against the second premise. Then in the third episode, we'll look at objections against the interpretation of the conclusion, that is to the step from concluding that the existence of universe was caused by something else to the conclusion that it has to be God as an entity that has certain properties. And finally, one of the objections that we could look at today against the first premise that goes against the particular theory of time that the first premise presupposes, we thought it would be better to deal with it in the last episode, because it is a very big objection and is one that's most commonly raised against the arguments, and it involves quite a bit of detail for us to be able to understand and compare the different theories of time. So we thought it would make sense to leave that separately for the last fourth episode in the critique of Kalam argument. So with that, I guess today, as I said, we'll just concentrate on the other objections to the first premise, leaving aside the time objection, the objection against the theory of time. And I guess what I want to bring to your attention now is this various arguments in support of the first premise. And today, when we'll be looking at the objections against the first premise, some of those objections would touch upon one or several of these presuppositions or arguments. So we'll make sure to clarify which of them we're attacking. So Dima, what do you think? Does that summarize the plan of attack for today?
I think it sounds great. It's good.
It's perfect. So shall we begin? So I guess we'll just go back to the usual format that we have. It will be in a form of discussion between Dima and myself. And we'll just take turns, maybe introducing different objections, and then start thinking and brainstorming together as to how to deal with them. So I guess the first objection that we wanted, against the first premise that we wanted to start with, is the objection from mereological nihilism. So Dima, do you want to take the floor and introduce what this objection consists in?
Sure, sounds great. I was wondering if we could just close maybe the PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, excellent. So I'll just stop sharing the screen. So yeah, we're both on here. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So it's a very interesting objection from something called mereological nihilism. It sounds really cool. Sounds like metally. Yes, so it involves the concepts of mereology, and it involves the concept of nihilism, right? So let's just define them real quick. So mereology has to do with an abstract study of the relations between parts and wholes. And nihilism, essentially, it has to do with the negation of commonly held philosophical concepts, right? It's an attitude of negation towards commonly held ideas. For example, in ethics, ethical nihilism would have to do with negating the existence of objective moral values and duties, say, right? Or when it comes to the meaning of life, nihilism would be a negation of that idea that, in fact, life is objectively meaningless, say, right? But in our case, it's a specific negation here, and it has to do with the negation of the existence of composite objects, objects that have parts, right? So mereological nihilists do not think that composite objects exist. So things like tables and chairs that are composed of parts, right? We think they're composed of parts. They would say that such things do not actually exist. There are no chairs, there are no tables, there are no computers, there are no pens, trees, and so forth. Anything that is composite is not an object in its own right. What it instead exists are simples, mereological simples. Just pick you can make a pick. It could be some atom, like some fundamental building block of physical reality. It could be such a simple, and these simples exist in various arrangements. So these simples might exist in or maybe arranged table-wise, say, right? But there really are no tables. So that would be the view. And it's in metaphysics, it's actually not a super popular view, probably because of how extreme and counterintuitive it is. But it's defended by very able metaphysicians like Peter von Inwagen, for example, right? But how is that relevant to the Kalam cosmological argument? Well, so one of the support for premise one is an appeal to our common experience in our everyday life, right? And so we experience, it is claimed, objects coming into being. We experience them existing, beginning to exist. And so we would say, you know, this chair didn't always exist. It came into being at a particular moment in time, or that tree didn't always exist. It came into being. And in each case, we know what the cause of its beginning to exist is, right? And so the argument then proceeds as an inductive inference for the metaphysical principle that something cannot come into being from nothing, right? That we get confirmation in our experience and in science of that. But if mereological nihilism is true, that's not the case. Trees don't exist, so they didn't come into being, right? Chairs don't exist as such. They did not come into being. Rather, what happened was that the simples had a new configuration, a new arrangement. But that's about it. And the simples themselves didn't come into being at that moment. So we don't, in fact, have a case of huge inductive support of almost everything we encounter coming into being, caused by something else, right? So that's basically the relevance of the truth of mereological nihilism to premise one.
So just to, I guess, summarize the relevance, would it be fair to say that It takes away this data that we have in the inductive argument, right? Because to be able to infer that the universe as a whole should fall under the same rule, that nothing comes into existence from nothing, we need this examples from inside the universe that we rely upon. But if we are defending the mereological nihilism and say that no objects do exist, we're not able to say that something comes into existence caused by something because there are no objects, and it just doesn't make sense to speak in this way. And so as soon as we take away that evidence, we cannot make that induction to the conclusion that the universe might have been brought into existence by something else, right?
Yeah, so that's right. So just to clarify, the mereological nihilists believe that material objects exist. It's just that they don't think that any of them are composite. They're simples, right? So they believe in the existence of material objects, just not as composite entities. And usually when we say our common experience confirms the coming into being of this or that, right, we are usually pointing to some composite object that came into existence. And if we can't do that because of the truth of mereological nihilism, then supposedly we have the weakening of the inductive case for the truth of premise one. That's right.
Right. So what would the defender of the Kalam argument say in response? Would he just try to deny the mereological nihilism, or could the defender of the Kalam argument accept the mereological nihilism and still defend the argument?
That's right. I think he could do both of those. So let's start with the first possibility. So the defender of the Kalam could just sort of resist the argument for mereological nihilism and just say, look, first of all, to start with, he could offer just a usual objection to it, just kind of common sense objection to it. And I could give an example of that. So I'm looking now at the screen, right, of my laptop, and it seems perfectly obvious that's what I'm doing. And so it seems perfectly obvious to me that my laptop exists. Yeah. And then moreover, see, I'm holding this glass of water, and I at least exist, right? And I'm holding it with my fingers and my hands, and I am a composite object, right? So that would be a kind of like Moorian shift, or a kind of appeal to the obviousness of the existence of at least myself, right? So we could think of Rene Descartes sort of saying, well, I at least know I exist. Like I at least can know that with certainty. And so there is, and so mereological nihilism could be seen as really counterintuitive, a kind of extreme view that needs a lot of convincing to sway one from what seems so perfectly clear. And if somebody just says, no, mereological nihilism seems to me to be true, then I guess one response would be to say, well, all right, that could be the cost of rejecting the inductive case, right, for premise one. That the cost of sort of rejecting the force of it is to adopt mereological nihilism, which seems quite extreme. And in a way, you could think of sort of what a theist is doing if he's trying to persuade the other side. At the end of the day, what we're doing in these kind of interactions is we're hopefully raising the price tag of whatever position we're trying to critique and say is not rational or true or plausible or what have you. And so so one way to think about it is that if mereological nihilism is intellectually costly, and that's as far as you have to go to reject this line of reasoning, well, okay, it's like, I'm fine, you could be fine with that, but that could be in itself, for those who don't subscribe to mereological nihilism, a kind of evidence of some of its force as a evidential line, that it leads people to adopt such a extreme view. So that's one path that I think a theist can explore. But another one, we could simply say, all right, guys like, so famous philosophers like Peter van Inwagen, for example, whom I highly, highly respect, is one of the top metaphysicians in the world. And he believes this doctrine, right? And, but he has a modified mereological nihilism. He doesn't have a global mereological nihilism, right? He wants to say, well, at least human beings exist. So selves can still exist. And so that would be more plausible to me. So at least I could say, look, even if with respect to chairs and tables and all that, I can't point to them and say, look, this supports the premise one, right? Inductively. I could at least say, I know I didn't always exist. I think you can recognize you didn't always exist. And at this point, either the person has to adopt some strange physicalist view according to which the person, the self, is still a simple, but yet has consciousness, which just goes against a lot of science, right? Which would say, no, 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 you need particular material configurations for consciousness to emerge. Or indeed, it would have to be substance dualism at this point, or some idea that I am myself just is this immaterial simple, metaphysically, a mind or a soul that is not itself composed of parts. And that may not be, again, a welcome position for somebody sticking to mereological nihilism. So that's yet kind of another path. And then finally, a theist could just say, look, you still have to deal with the other two arguments, right? Because even if all that exists are simples, you could reformulate the premise one in such a way that we're now dealing with by the physical universe, you just mean all of those simples beginning to exist. And so all of the cosmology in favor of the absolute beginning of the physical universe could be reformulated to fit the mereological nihilist taste as a claim about simples, that at some point in the past they had a beginning. And then at least the metaphysical argument, the appeal to metaphysical intuition would still be something that mereological nihilists would have to reckon with, and also another, that would be the primary argument for him to reckon with.
Right. But so on this last point, before we discuss the first one, so on this last point, if you just say, well, fine, you just have this, some atomic particles or some other simples that must have come into existence, but doesn't the argument have lose a little bit of its bite? Because, you know, the whole force of the argument was in us actually witnessing some things or objects coming into existence. Which cannot be said about the, you know, subatomic articles, right? It's not that we see them come into existence, and as a matter of fact, we sometimes are not even able to see them. It's our theory and physics are telling them that they exist, but we ourselves are not able to observe them, and certainly not observe them coming into existence. And I guess on another level, maybe we'll discuss it later. I guess when we talk about physics, there is evidence of some particles coming in and out of existence and not being able to track that. So doesn't this all sort of reduction to this elementary particles undermine the force of the argument?
It certainly does. I would say it does if mereological nihilism is accepted, yes. Yeah. So you're right about that. It would weaken the support for premise one substantially. Correct. Yeah. But
so then coming back to mereological nihilism, I guess what I wanted to flag is that that's not the only view available out there that sort of rejects the existence of composite objects. So there are some other views that have been defended, and essentially it's something like a conceptual relativism, where you say that, you know, things like selves and chairs and desks and computer screens, they do exist, but they depend for their existence on our concepts. So there is sort of a universe, and it consists either of elementary particles or perhaps of one lump of matter, but we carve this matter with concepts. So for instance, when you speaking of a glass standing on your desk, you can speak of a desk and a glass as two separate objects because you have these two separate concepts. And by concepts, we mean introduction of something like persistence conditions, which allow us to tell that it's the very same object persistent over time. And those persistent conditions, they're not part of the Maya-independent universe. So it's something that we bring into the world and sort of add on to this matter. And so there can be alternative concepts to the one that we have. So someone can say, instead of trying to distinguish a glass and the chair, they may speak of a glass, a chair as one object or something, right? And united together, right? And so I guess one motivation for this view is sometimes we're not able to tell where one object ends and the other begins. Like if we thinking of a wall, for instance, containing of many bricks of our other pieces of matter, like how do we divide it into several objects? Or another motivation for this view is sort of coexisting objects, right? Like the statue, which is made of clay. So how do we tell the statue and the clay that it's made of? Like, for instance, we can destroy the statue, but supposedly the clay would still be in there. So maybe there are two objects, but how can they be in the same place? And so this view would come with a ready explanation of that, saying that, well, there's really no statue, there's really no clay, there's just a lump of matter, but you can describe it in different ways because you can have introduced different persistent conditions, and so you can come up with different objects depending on what these conditions are, and this can be, you know, a lump of clay or a statue. So basically, this way, this view can be an alternative to mereological nihilism, and I guess it will also somewhat undermine the force of the inductive arguments. So, do you any ideas you have how could the because this view supposedly is a little more common sense, like it's not like in your face, like there are no objects. It says, there are objects, but it's all relative.
Yeah. So I have just three thoughts on this, Anton, briefly. The first one is that let's just try, first of all, to say, look, when you press mereological nihilist and the person says, yes, strictly speaking, the proposition there are chairs is false. Let's try to kind of make them look less crazy, right? So what they could still say is, look, but even though the proposition that is expressed is false, there is a close proposition in the vicinity that is true. And moreover, the first proposition that there are chairs has, if not truth conditions, assertability conditions that make it rational for most folk to still assert there are chairs. And so then it depends on this translation between, or this kind of the looking for this close enough proposition.
Oh, Dima, I'm afraid you've frozen there for a second.
Say, well, proposition is true. Simples are arranged table-wise. Some simples are arranged table-wise, and that's sufficient. So that would be just one thing I want to say. But there are problems with that view, and we don't have time to kind of go into it. But directly to your point here, I like this. I like this view that you laid out. It's very interesting to me. But so there are two things. One is that I'm not sure it would fit very well with natural kinds. So it might be very, very illuminating when it comes to things like chairs and tables that have functions that we ascribe to them and things like that. But when it comes to, say, particular dinosaurs existing before any human being emerged on the scene and the conceptual machinery came to be, right? I think it is mind independently true that there were dinosaurs, right? So that, at least in a way, science presupposes that when it describes the world. And it presupposes that there is objectivity with respect to at least some things that it discusses. So there is that kind of worry. But finally, I'm not sure, Anton, that it is actually a legitimate alternative. So when you say it's relativism, are you not presupposing that objectively speaking, it's not true that there are chairs? That objectivity is out of the window, and in that sense, it is a form of mereological nihilism, at least with respect to the normal talk that we think what we're saying is objectively the case. There are chairs, there are objects, there are computers. I exist. Whereas this view would just be a variant of it, not so much an alternative to it. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that does. I mean, I guess this view makes it a little bit easy to swallow because it's not as against the common sense, I guess. But But that's right. I guess that's right. That on this view, strictly speaking, they're mind independently. There are no
Yeah.
objects, right?
There are no. Yeah.
There's just matter, right?
Yeah.
And so in this way, it's close to biological nihilism, but with a twist, though, because on this view, one doesn't have to commit oneself to there being some elementary particles. One can just say, it's just all one lump of matter. Because once you speak, the problem with the meteorological nihilism is that once you speak of some fundamental particles, the question is that why do you have to stop there? Why can't you divide them any further? And if just for this view, the idea is that there are no objects because there are no mind independent persistence conditions for objects to exist, and then there would have to be such conditions for elementary particles. So perhaps on this view, you may want to deny their existence as well. Or
that's good.
But,
so right. So basically, you're saying, how can you resist this reductionism? How can you resist this analysis? Because we invariably keep on using concepts as we speak about what's true, even on this view. And I want to say, like, in a way, I think this worry is pretty global. So, for example, even if you say there are no simples, but you say something like there's just matter. Well, what is matter? We're using our concepts. We have some grasp. Either we're saying something that has little meaning, or we're saying something meaningful with truth conditions, and then you go, well, why make an exception to this thing, and then not allow simples, and then not allow composite objects? And so here we're back to
So I guess on this view, someone can say that matter is just the meteorological whole. It's all that there is, right? So there's nothing but matter, and then we sort of part of that entire whole, but we sort of carve ourselves out of that matter, and we carve out other things out of that matter, and so everything is dependent for its existence in a way. Everything except the matter is dependent on its existence on our concepts, which we bring to the worlds. And it's interesting, like with the natural kind, the example you brought, and it's one thing that came to mind, like, when you're out hiking or something and there is like a big, large animal that wants to attack you, for instance, a bear, right? And so if there's several people, what one of the advice, what you have to do is like you stand together and you hug each other. And that way the bear would think that there are not just several individuals, but would think there's a very large animal, right? And the bear wouldn't be able to tell if it's one or five. So it's like whether there's one or five people for the bear, it depends on the concept that it has. Perception. So, I'm not sure about the dinosaurs, whether they ever existed. But if they did, the good question to ask is like, to what extent we can carve them out from the from matter as individual objects. But anyway, I think that's taken us to
I loved it though. I loved it. Good stuff.
I guess at this point, I just recall this episode from Fry and Laurie about the philosophy of language, and we should make an introduction something. And now we're talking about whether chairs exist. But back to the existence of God.
As bad as that. Yes.
This is the meteorological nihilism objection that's trying to undermine the force of the argument, the first premise. So I don't know, should we anything else that we should say about that, or should we move maybe to the next point?
Just to say that it has a lot of common sense counter intuitions to it that has to be overcome, including some scientific talk about molecules existing, about us discovering this and that as a composite object. It explicitly depends on that. And it's not that it's impossible to kind of explain it. It's just, it seems to me there's a lot of work has to be done to make it more plausible, let's just say. So in that sense, it's a puzzle that's interesting, but it's not moving me personally too much yet. But I haven't studied this in depth. So
All right, but let's move on to the second objection against the first premise, and that is David Hume's claim that we can conceive of something coming into being uncaused out of nothing, right? So the conceivability objection. What do we make of that? Do you want to spell it out in a little further detail?
Yeah. So the question is, did Hume in fact succeed in conceiving of something coming into being uncaused? So the way that I read Hume there is that he basically says, look, the sort of case Hume had in mind is this: there is empty space, right? Nothing occupies that space, and then suddenly an object appears. Let's say a horse all of a sudden just appears, and so of course that's imaginable. Like we could imagine a horse just appearing, and the claim that Hume made is that he thereby was able to conceive of the horses coming into being uncaused. Mm-hmm. And I guess the relevant question is, did he succeed? And another question is, if he did succeed, what import does that have? So we might want to discuss that. But in my view, I doubt that he did in fact succeed in conceiving the horse coming into being uncaused. Right. So how would I argue about that? So think of it like this. We could conceive of some man without at the same time conceiving of how tall that man is, right? That seems correct. But it doesn't follow from that any man can exist without having some specific height, right? So in general, to conceive of A without at the same time conceiving of B is not the same as conceiving of A's existing without B. Okay, so, but then if I can conceive of a horse suddenly appearing, right, without at the same time conceiving of its cause, it doesn't follow from that I have conceived of its coming into being without a cause, right? Let alone that I thereby have reason to think that it's possible for it to exist without a cause, right? So that's one line. And then another one is coming from a philosopher, Elizabeth Anscombe, and I really like this one. She basically asks, well, all right, what Hume needed to give us is a case where, so there's there is an instance of supposed conception of something coming into being with or without a cause. It's like that is part of the whole point here, that what Hume tried to do is that he was able to conceive of something coming into being. But she wants to ask, did he though? In particular, why think it's an instance of say the horse is coming into being coming into being, and not say the horses being transported from somewhere else or teleported, and then just appearing in a particular locale. So Hume would need to add something to his scenario in order to differentiate between the case of something being teleported with the same result of just appearing before us, right? And the case of something's coming into being, let alone coming into being uncaused. And so that's a problem. And it seems like the only thing that Hume could at this point appeal to differentiate between the two cases would be not the imagining of the thing appearing, that is the same, but it would be pointing to a different cause. So in one case, somebody teleported it or transported it, but in another case, what exactly? And at this point, I want to say the cause comes back at him to bite him. So that's sort of, for those two reasons, I don't grant that he was able to conceive of something's coming into being uncaused. Out of nothing.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
what are your thoughts?
Let me try to defend my old friend David. So on the first point that you brought, right? So you bring this example where we can conceive of a man without at the same time conceiving what height they have.
Yes.
Right. And so, and then from that, the next step that we make is saying that, well, even if we can conceive a man without conceiving his height, we're still certain that the man cannot exist without having.
Or it doesn't follow that the man can exist without having some specific height.
Right. But sort of the support for this second claim, it doesn't come from our imagination or our
Yeah,
conceivability.
that's right.
So we have a separate reason to believe that it's not possible, right? So that the
Yes.
man must have height. But then, so we need that sort of separate separate reference to reason to support our argument. But then I guess
Or even experience, right? Even
yeah,
experience
yeah,
of never coming across anyone without a specific height.
yeah. But so that sort of, I guess, for me, somewhat undermines the original argument, because the original argument that nothing comes into existence from nothing relied in particular on experience. But now we're sort of retrieving a little bit, and we're stepping back and we're relying on some additional reinforcement. So it seems like the experience is now not enough, because if we cannot just argue based on our imagination and conceivability, so it seems like the Hume's objection would have some force then, making the opponent retrieve a little bit. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So let me see if I am understanding your worry. You're saying, if Hume is not allowed to be able to conceive of something coming into being uncaused out of nothing, then how can we normally appeal to our everyday experience of it not happening, which relies on observation, to bolster the first premise or the metaphysical principle, if it's not even conceivable what it would look like, or that we can't actually ever even conceive of that observation? In other words, then it becomes, then the first premise is almost unfalsifiable, but then the third line of support supposed to say, look, it's never been falsified, as if that's an important achievement, right? But if it's in principle unfalsifiable, then you can't appeal to the fact that it's unfalsified as grounds for thinking it's true. Is this where where you made this connection, Anton, or have I gone too far?
Yeah, I guess maybe falsifiability is a good way to think of it, because if we're relying on our experience, and the point of Hume's argument is trying to falsify that and saying, well, look, I can imagine I think coming in existence out of nothing, so I falsified that. And you say, oh, no, you can't falsify that, because there's reason to think that cannot happen. Like with the man who must have height, even if you think of him without the object. So, and you sort of alluding to not to experience here, you're alluding to reason that we are to accept.
Yes. So let me try to clarify this. So because now this is a little bit different. So here's the claim. So the general claim is that to conceive of A without at the same time conceiving of B. So in our case, to conceive of a man without at the same time conceiving of how tall he is not the same thing of conceiving of a man without height. So that's step one. In other words, to conceive of A without at the same time conceiving of B is not the same as conceiving of A existing without B. Right. So that's the first point. Then the further claim would be to say, and it doesn't follow that it's possible for the man to be without some specific height, for any man to exist without some specific height. In other words, now we're leaving conceivability and pointing to the fact that for whatever reason, however it's grounded, inductively or I think inductively, that we just, we've never come across a man without a height. That just seems like evident to us, right? So you see this move. First, it's a claim about conceivability, that you gotta, to conceive of something as existing without some other thing requires more than just conceiving of one part of it as existing and just not conceiving of this other thing altogether. That's a different enterprise. So that's a first general point. And I wonder what you think about that move. Because if it's accepted, then essentially all we're saying is conceivability was not successful here. But yeah, any thoughts on this? And then additional point was the existence, the possibility of, which is metaphysics, the possibility of the existence of a thing in question without this other thing. Yeah.
So I think we essentially, when we're talking about this man and trying to separate him from his height, when we make the second step and saying that regardless of the fact that we can conceive of him existing without at the same time conceiving that he has a specific height.
Yes.
Uh,
Not him existing without the height.
right.
Without
right.
at the same time conceiving of
his height, right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so we say that that doesn't mean that he can exist without the height. And when we make this second claim, we say that it's not possible for a man to exist without having the height, even though we can conceive of him existing without at the same time conceiving his height. So when we make this second claim, mm-hmm. we're not relying on conceivability to make that claim. We're relying on something else. We're relying on the reason we have mm-hmm. to conclude, mm-hmm. and that reason, can be inductive, perhaps, or can be based on something else. But anyway, it's a separate argument from conceivability, right? And it seems like the argument for the first premise in the Kalam cosmological argument, it did rely on conceivability, right? So we're not attacking that part here. We're making a separate claim, and that
right. And this is that's why I wanted to bring the point that there is a middle step that I, in my presentation, didn't clearly make for the example I used of man and his height, namely that the general principles I later talked about would also preclude us from concluding that we have successfully conceived even of him existing without a height, by merely conceiving of him existing, mm-hmm. and not at all conceiving of how tall he is. So in other words, so there is the middle ground that we fail to conceive of the man existing without mm-hmm. some height, mm-hmm. because all we did is to conceive that he exists, and failed to or didn't conceive mm-hmm. of how tall he is. These are just separate enterprises, right? They're not the same, is the argument. And we could see that when we look at other examples. Mm-hmm. And essentially, the reason why it's even relevant is we're dealing with the idea of something coming into being, but then there is a second term, uncaused out of nothing, right? And it's that second term that if you don't at the same time somehow bring into your conception, you haven't mm-hmm. engaged yet with the thing to be conceived. Mm-hmm. You've only engaged with, let's say, one part of it, the mm-hmm. appearance. Mm-hmm. that is there mm-hmm. For the effect, but you haven't even engaged with conceptually with the cause at this point.
Right.
Does that make sense? In other words, we're still saying if it's So sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No. But just coming back to, I guess, Hume's original example about
yes.
Let's take a horse coming into existence out of nothing, and so. The objection is that, well, you still have to explain where it came from, right? Because perhaps it was transported, it was teleported, or made on site or something. But why cannot Hume reply that he specifically conceives of it as just coming into existence, just appearing, and which excludes the possibility that it was teleported or made out of other objects on site. So I can try to conceive that now as we speak, and it just appears and full stop. It hasn't been transported or
right. So that's very, very helpful. But by the way, now we move to the other line, right? We're now moving to this other line, and we're discussing a different argument against Hume here. So this other line basically says, look, all that you have imagined, because what Hume is doing here is he thinks of conceivability here as imaginability. He thinks of look, we can imagine a horse just appearing. You can, in your imagination, picture a horse just suddenly appearing. And now I would say that we can do easily, no doubt about that. In our imagination, we could just imagine there's empty space and the horse not pops into existence uncaused, but the horse just appears. Like we didn't see it before, here it is. That's as far as our imagination goes. Now, I guess the question to you is, are you actually conceiving of it not having a cause? And what would it even mean to say that you are? Clearly, you're conceiving of it just appearing. Mm-hmm. But that's compatible with teleportation. The observation of something that wasn't there appearing would be exactly the same on the assumption that the causal story is very different.
Yeah. But
Go ahead.
Can I just add the assumption saying, oh, and no, it hasn't been teleported from anywhere?
Well, in that case, what you're doing is not so much conceiving of the idea, but stipulating what is the case with respect to some imaginary object, or you're just saying it, you're not conceiving. And our task was supposed to conceive of the idea of something's coming into being uncaused, right?
Yeah, but
so there's a difference between stipulating and conceiving.
Yeah, but maybe conceiving of something coming into existence without a cause doesn't presuppose conceiving of something else other than its appearing, because there is no cause, so there's nothing else to conceive here. So, but if you're asking me, I can stipulate and explain to you why I am not conceiving anything. Elements.
And the point just is to say that imaginability has a limit here, because the same imagination would be used by someone who would give a completely different, make a completely different add-on to it. And that's exactly the point, that you have the same conception as this other person.
Right.
And all we've added is words. It's almost like, look, you could say, for example, it's a silly example, but I could use it. We could say, well, can you conceive of a squared circle or something like that? And I could say, well, I bring before my mind a circle that begins to morph, and then I'll just stipulate that, and in fact, it's square, or its sides are such and such. I have left conception at some point, and I've just gone to stipulation of what it is that I want to talk about or try to present. So that would be Anscombe's point.
Yeah. So basically, the point is that this conception of something coming into existence out of nowhere would be indistinguishable from a conception of something being teleported, and so this just questions whether we can use that as an example of conception of coming out of nowhere.
As a successful conception.
Right, because it's so indistinguishable. Okay.
Yeah. So that's the challenge, at least, that a human would have to deal with at this point.
All right. No, that's a great point. Good. So maybe we should move to the next objection, though.
Let's do it.
And so I guess the third one was the one that talks about intuitions, intuitions about what's metaphysically possible and the fact that they may not be reliable. Do you want to lay out this objection?
Yes. So this is where, honestly, So the thought here, the strategy here is to say, look, we're appealing to raw intuitions about metaphysical possibility in one of the lines of support for premise one, right? Which is that, that it's obvious to us somehow that out of nothing, nothing comes. And it's an appeal to our intuition. And there could be all sorts of various strategies, I guess, of trying to undercut the confidence that we are in a position to track truth with respect to metaphysical possibility and necessity from an armchair. That what guarantees that my cognitive powers, say, are such that I can do a thing like that, or there could be all sorts of strategies here. This is where wherever you want to go, I'll go. But it could be, I don't know, let's just evolutionary objection, that we have not evolved to have reliable cognitive faculties because these grand metaphysical discussions aren't directly relevant to survivability, and so maybe we just haven't evolved the faculties that are reliable enough for truth tracking with respect to metaphysical claims. Right? So that's one line. So honestly, it's hard to just say a single strategy here. There are different strategies, but they all have something in common, namely attempt to undermine the confidence that our intuitions are weighty for us to have, to have belief that the principle out of nothing, nothing comes is true. So that would be the argument. Do you want to say or choose among them for us to explore?
Well, I mean, maybe we could focus on the one that talks about evolution and saying that, well, it just so happens that we're structured this way, because it
Yes.
contributed to our survival. So the things in our environment do indeed usually come into existence because they have a cause, and it just makes helpful for us to conceptualize our environment that way. But the limit of our imagination and the concept that we use to talk about our environments doesn't put any limits on the universe itself. And so why should we be so narrow-minded when we think about the world and the universe? Right?
So here's what I want to say about something general, which would apply to the evolutionary debunking or the evolutionary line of argumentation at this point, which is this. It is really, really hard once you begin to go down the route of undermining our cognitive faculties and their reliability to constrain that only to those things we want to reject. In other words, there might be an issue of greedy reductionism or greedy spread of the skepticism,
right?
Which ultimately might be self-defeating, because the very talk that the very argument there that the person is making relies on grand metaphysical notions of what's true and real about the world. And the whole evolutionary paradigm is a grand narrative that we want to say about what is true mind independently. And we are doing, at least to a large extent, some metaphysics there, right? About what's in fact the case about the world as such. So if you're doing that, so I guess the self-defeat would be that it would undermine the very objection, because it relies on the very things that it wants to then put a doubt onto. So in other words, the challenge that I would have for somebody arguing this way is just to try to constrain it in such a way that it only deals with this class of things we call metaphysical intuition. And I honestly don't think that the evolutionary argument can do the constraining, honestly. We can undermine ethics immediately, we can undermine aesthetics, we can undermine all sorts of other things that the person usually doesn't want undermined.
Right. Unless he's
an
about all this
amoral philosopher.
An amoral philosopher, right.
Right. So. But that would again be an instance of a cost that you would pay in rejecting otherwise quite intuitive and plausible line. What are your thoughts on this, Anton?
No, I think that's right. I think that's right, at least to an extent, and it sounds convincing. I don't know if we should explore other interpretations of this argument, or
maybe something to add to this, just to map the territory for people, because I think we're using concepts like imaginability, conceivability, metaphysical possibility, and people can get lost. So what I'd like to do now is just to briefly define, and I want to hear your thoughts, whether you agree with me on what these concepts mean and how to use them. So basically, imaginability has to do with us trying to picture things in our mind, literally draw a picture, and then bring it before one's mind. And imaginability is often said to be sufficient for something's being conceivable. So if we say, well, I was able to imagine successfully such and such, we usually say, well, therefore, if you really did imagine successfully, it's conceivable. But here is what we, I think, rightly would not want to say. If I fail to imagine something in this picturesque way, it's therefore inconceivable. So here's an example why that doesn't follow. In geometry, we can conceive and speak about and know of objects, figures that have 1,000 sides to them. And yet to actually picture that object before us would not be possible. Or when physicists talk about other dimensions of reality, they're not talking gibberish. They could present rigorous mathematics to back it up, right? And even some observation to try to convince us of that. And yet it's not something we could imagine, because our imagination might be already limited with respect to some, I don't know, transcendental categories, with respect to some constraints like space and time. Like we can't think outside of those constraints. And moreover, not just think, we cannot picture things, imagine things outside of those constraints. But conceivability seems to be broader than that.
Right.
So there is that I wanted to say now, but then there is another question, but what about conceivability and its relation to possibility? And here I just want to say, look, conceivability, if we reflect, as Immanuel Kant did, on the fact that we interpret the world necessarily through whatever cognitive faculties we have, it would be, I think, presumptuous for us to say, look, my being able to conceive of something proves that something is truly metaphysically possible. Or indeed, that my failure to conceive of something proves in a kind of infallible way, it's an infallible guide to what's metaphysically possible. I think we should be more modest about that. But I think it's open for one to say, the sources for my belief about what's metaphysically possible and impossible include conceivability. But it's a fallible guide. I'm open to being corrected. I am holding it with a bit of a distance here. I'm not grasping at it as the only thing, right? And so usually there would be two sources for people's beliefs about metaphysical possibility and impossibility. Besides, okay, so one is conceivability of something, being able to conceive. But another one would be just experience, because there is a modal principle which says that if something is actual, it's possible. Like if I come across something's existing, well, I don't need to further investigate whether that is possible. It's possible. I just experienced it. It's true. So from something's being actual, it follows that it's possible. So induction and empirical investigation of the world matters for what beliefs we should form about metaphysical possibility. But I don't think that's the only thing that matters. I think conceivability has a role to play. That's my view, but I wonder whether you would agree or disagree with that.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think that's very helpful. So on the first point, I guess trying to make a distinction between imaginability and conceivability, something that you mentioned is that sometimes imaginability is not a necessary condition for conceiving of something. In other words, like the example you gave for the
Correct.
Geometrical figures, sometimes we cannot picture it, so we cannot imagine it, but it's conceivable nonetheless that such a figure exists. And I guess the reverse of that relationship between conceivability and imaginability can be that maybe sometimes imaginability is not sufficient for conceivability. Not only it's not necessary, or would we say that if we can imagine something that's sufficient for us to be able to conceive of it? So I guess that's coming back to the discussion we had on Hume's objection, right? So is it, because, well, in that particular example, the claim was that we haven't really pictured what we had to picture to say that it's
that I have imagined, right?
But are there any examples maybe you can think of where imaginability would not be sufficient for something to be conceived, or is it always?
So my hunch would be to say that it's sufficient for conceivability. However, what I want to say is we could easily be fooled. We could think that we have imagined something successfully, but due to ignorance, we have failed. Especially when we make claims about particular objects and what would obtain and so on, right? So we use imaginability quite a lot in our everyday life. We say, okay, I know what could happen if I did this. And it is a guide to action often. But we know that we may lack the kind of grasp of the thing that we are wanting to imagine, and then form beliefs about what we did when we exercised our imagination, right? We may lack knowledge. We may be mistaken about certain things. So in other words, I would say, imagine whether I have successfully imagined X may not be an incorrigible belief, or it may not be something that's always transparent and something that is guaranteed, that you just have that instant, like infallible, I guess, access to what in fact you successfully imagined. That is a kind of further. But if it's stipulated you did imagine it successfully, I would say it's sufficient for conceivability. Right. So that's my view.
And I guess another point about the distinction is trying to think of what it is that grounds conceivability. So you mentioned that when we speak about imaginability, another way to think of it is just picturing something, right?
Yeah.
And then with the conceivability, sometimes we kind of picture something, but then the question is, what is it then that the conceivability is ultimately grounded in? Is it ultimately grounded maybe in some other facts or events that we can imagine in its turn, and we just derive the possibility to conceive of something from this other fact? So is it like another level of reasoning almost?
Yeah. I would say so. I would say it involves not so much picturing, but intellection, involves grasping an idea. Like in mathematics, we can have that without necessarily pictures. We could or geometry rather would be a good example, I think, here, is that because it can easily involve actual objects or drawings and so on. But so for example, let me give you an example. I can conceive of a triangle and what has to be true about it, right, successfully, even if it also turns out that my imagining it will require adding contingent facts about the triangle that wasn't part of my conception, like the color of my lines that I bring in my, like before me in my imagination.
Right. Yeah.
And like lines being read in no way is the essence of the concept of a triangle. So what is it that we've done through our pure reason when we conceived of a triangle previously? I would want to resist saying necessarily it's tied to all these instances of it in our imagination. We grasp, if you go Platonic, we grasp the essence of a triangle,
Right.
form of the triangle, but not so much the any particular instance of that.
Yeah. Or otherwise, maybe we're abstracting from particular cases by zooming in on those properties that we think are essential of the triangle, and so we come up with this concept of the triangle, which is the abstraction from any
particular. You're right. Yeah, it's another level. I think in that case, I guess, yes, it's another level of engaging pure reason. Yeah.
All right, but I think in the interest of time, we have to move on, because I think we've been going on for about an hour, and what we're trying to do with our episodes is to try to make them a little shorter for our audience to make it easier to follow. So, but we still have some material to cover in this one. So let's move on to the next objection, which deals with composition fallacy. So Dima, why don't you lay out that objection for us?
Yeah, so, right, so we need to understand what the fallacy of composition is, right? And it's the fallacy of reasoning that just because parts of something has some property, that the object as a whole must have the same property. So an example would be that just because every tiny part of an elephant is light in weight, it would be fallacious to conclude that the whole elephant is light in weight. No, weight adds up, and the aggregate is pretty big. So, but at the same time, we recognize that sometimes you can infer from what's true about the parts that something is true about the whole. So, for example, it follows from the fact that every part of the picket, every picket of the fence is green, that the entire fence is green. That follows. So there are cases when it follows, but what you can do is say just because it's true of parts, it must be true of wholes. There is no guarantee that it would be. And so that would be a logical fallacy. And the way that this is tied to the Kalam is that the objector, the detractor wants to say, look, you, the proponent of the Kalam, is reasoning from what's true about parts of the universe to what's true about the universe as a whole. So you are guilty of this composition fallacy in your reasoning, right? So that's the objection. Do you want to add anything to it before I sort of try to defend against that objection? Because I do.
I think that states it pretty well. So yeah, why don't we go to the defense then?
Yeah, so I want to reject the idea that the proponent of the Kalam, who knows what he's doing or she's doing, is arguing this way, arguing from composition, that the person goes from it's true of every part of the universe to it's true about the universe as a whole. So, right, so I think it's most pertinent to the third line of evidential support, where we said, look, in our experience, we see this and that, and we take that to be some evidence that something is potentially true of the universe, right? So in other words, we're making this inductive inference. And what I want to say is exactly that. What the proponent of the Kalam is doing at this point is basically saying, look, I'm drawing an inductive inference from what's true about some things in a class of things, right? What's true about the sample of things in a certain class to what's true about the class as a whole, right? So in that sense, you're making an inductive inference. It's no guarantee that it must be the case. That's the nature of induction. But it's basically saying, look, we're dealing with metaphysical principles here, not some physical law that describes what happens with objects in space-time. We're making a metaphysical claim that says that out of nothing, nothing comes, or something cannot come into being out of nothing. The something in question there, because it's metaphysics we're dealing with, will be a class of all things whatsoever, tiny, big, it doesn't matter. It's a metaphysical principle we're dealing with. So the universe would apply as long as it's a thing, right? It would, at least in the minds of the proponents of the Kalam, that's what they're doing. It's saying, of all things whatsoever, regardless, because it's metaphysics, if it comes into being, then it must have a cause or some such. And the universe would fall under that class. And so it is an inductive case of sorts. Now, you could resist that inductive case, but it's quite another to represent the structure of inference as arguing from composition. At no point, I think, anyone defending the Kalam is actually arguing something is true of parts of the universe, therefore something must be true of the universe as a whole. Rather, it's a metaphysical principle that would apply to all entities whatsoever, and that would include the universe. And then it would be of some weight to then say, look, we just haven't come across anything that disconfirms that, or because think of it, metaphysical principles have to be in line with what we observe. Otherwise, they're bad metaphysical principle. If you're making a universal metaphysical claim about all reality, then coming upon any counterexample is sufficient to say, in your experience, right, of physical reality, say, it's sufficient for you to conclude, look, there's something wrong with the metaphysical principle. It can be universal, or it just isn't true, period. So yeah, that would be my basic brief response.
Yeah, right. But so a couple of thoughts on this. So
yeah, please.
I guess the initial reaction is that someone could say that perhaps this move is a little bit ad hoc, like this jump from physical to metaphysical all of a sudden, right? Because maybe it would need to have some more justification. So if I understand the move correctly, so someone can come back and say that, like, there is a fallacy here because we've been talking about the parts of the whole, and what we say about the parts of the whole does not necessarily apply to the whole as such. And you say, well, that would be a fallacy if we were talking about the physical properties, but we're not talking about physical properties. We're talking about the metaphysical, right? And so when we're speaking about on the metaphysical level about things that are true about parts of the universe, supposedly the same would apply to everything, and because universe would be included in this class of things that we're talking about
things.
On the metaphysical level. But then I guess it's here when it makes a little bit ad hoc how we create this class of things, and because it seems that when we talk about the very concept of universe, it presupposes that everything else is a part of that whole, the universe. So that's the very concept of universe that we have, and that's what makes the move based on this argument of fallacy apply to this case. And so, but you say, oh no, we shouldn't consider other things as parts of the universe. We should just make them equal members of some universal class of things, so they will all be on par. And so this particular introduction of this class can seem a little bit sort of ad hoc.
Yeah, And so it's absolutely open to the detractor to try to say, well, should we create such classes, to try to go there. But what I'm, I guess, arguing at this point is, I don't think the composition fallacy represents what in fact goes on in how the theist is arguing here. What the theist, I think, is doing is there is a metaphysical principle that he looks for in the world. Where else, right? If we're making an inductive case, to see whether it's what we experience is in line with that or not. That's why we just sort of appeal. Yeah, well, all I can say is that I look around and things just seem to confirm that, and I don't have good reasons to think that they disconfirm. Now, we will come to quantum mechanics in a bit, but that's at least what the theist is trying to do there. It's the inductive case, not for some physical principle. So in other words, what I'm saying is it's from the beginning to end a metaphysical discussion of what's true metaphysically about any objects. At no point am I restricting it to only physical. At no point am I restricting, for example, it to what's true in the universe only. I'm always mindful of the fact that we're dealing with metaphysics here and a universal claim about anything whatsoever that begins to exist. And in that sense, my experience simply is there for me to confirm or disconfirm that metaphysical principle, right? Does it make sense that I'm not actually concerned here to vindicate any physical law at all, which would indeed only apply to what's true in the universe? I am here from the beginning to end interested in supporting evidentially, fallibly, because induction is fallible, it does not guarantee the truth, right? Of the conclusion, but it's an evidence of sorts that there is no disconfirmation and there is constant confirmation of what's true of this metaphysical principle, which I think is straightforwardly involves everything that exists, including universes. Yeah.
But I guess the point would be that, look, like this whole idea that nothing comes into existence out of nothing.
That something cannot come into existence out of nothing, right? Yes.
The whole idea came to us on the physical level from observing the physical stuff in this universe, right? If we want to move to a different level, and if you want to say that, this fallacy of postulating something about the whole from postulating something about the parts does not apply because it only applies on the physical level, or we're talking here of metaphysical level, so it's a whole different ballgame, then we can say, well, then this whole initial idea about something not being able to come into existence out of nothing also doesn't have to apply here, because anything's up for grabs. We're on the metaphysical level, we can, introduce any rules to this ballgame.
Yeah, so now notice, now it's a claim about, again, reliability with respect to pontificating about metaphysical reality, or what's true metaphysically speaking, what must be the case metaphysically speaking.
Yeah, and
we're now at this point kind of moving there. But I want to say, before that, I want to say simply, the way I see how at least Craig structures it, his main drive is his metaphysical intuition. His main drive is that first principle. The inductive case simply is confirmatory. It's not sufficient on its own to get you there. It simply is a kind of a helpful add-on that you can point to people and say, look, if you're an empiricist, that should matter to you. You shouldn't completely disregard this as relevant. If you are thinking, well, what about the universe? I mean, and so at this point, indeed, you are speaking metaphysics, true. But similarly, I am still speaking of metaphysics when I'm talking about chairs coming into being, say. I'm still doing metaphysics. And that's my point, that it's always about that principle that's metaphysical from beginning to end. That's why we're not making this illicit move from true about strictly only things in the universe because we're dealing with physical laws only that describes physical phenomena to then, if that makes sense.
Yeah. But I guess my point was that, our metaphysics ought to be constrained by our physics, right? The way I see the relation between physics and metaphysics is that our physics can tell us only that much, and we can have some competing theories, which, on the facts that we have, all of them can be equally true. And that's where metaphysics come come into picture, right? So we can have different metaphysical theories that would be equally in line with the physical theories that we have. And so the physics wouldn't help us choose it between them, but the physics would at least exclude those metaphysical theories that contradict the physical theories, right?
Exactly.
And so if on the physical level, we have a particular rule about something or a particular understanding, and when we move to the metaphysical level, someone says, oh, that does no longer apply here because we're on the metaphysical level, my initial reaction would be, no, that still applies as a constraint, right? So, so if it applies on the level of, nothing should come into existence out of nothing, right? Then perhaps this move about the fallacy of the mereological fallacy, it should also stay.
So this is interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think I understand what you're saying. I want to say, look, if we know something is physically possible, we thereby know that it's metaphysically possible. There is that relation. And indeed, if something is now, but when you said that it constrains, did you mean that all there is really physical possibility? That the metaphysical possibility reduces the physical possibility. That is to say, when theoretical physicists talk about universes having different physical laws, or talking about parallel realities, they're basically necessarily talking about something that's metaphysically impossible because it's not physically possible. And I want to say, no, I'm not willing to sort of adopt that stringent constraint.
Right. But then, so in that case, when something can be physically impossible in our universe, but metaphysically possible in, say, another universe, that's one thing. But when we stick into the same universe where we're in, right, supposedly, what's physically impossible, well, if it was metaphysically possible, it would be a different universe, right? So our universe has a set of physical laws that already apply. So at least as far as we say in this universe, what's metaphysically impossible what's physically impossible would supposedly also be metaphysical impossible in that narrow sense.
But just think of the implications of that. So cosmology, there are many models of the early universe and how the universe came to exist that honestly would have to be looked down upon from this constraint, because it wouldn't be a description of anything that we in fact are observing around us. We're dealing with something different. Right. In other words, it would almost be a composition fallacy in reverse to say, because there are properties of what we observe around us, it must be the case that we're constraining what's the fact about the universe as a whole, right? So it's a kind of parts to whole assumption here. Would you not say that I think could be sort of problematic because it would be an instance of composition? Or you I guess disagree?
No, I guess the different theories and models of the universe coming into existence, if we were to accept one of these models, that would still be compatible with the physics that we have, or would it just deny all the physical laws?
So here's what it will go beyond it, necessarily beyond, but that's exactly then we're introducing metaphysical possibility that goes beyond physical. So it's not constrained in the relevant sense of we are disallowed from talking about anything that goes beyond what is physically described by our physical laws with respect to things we observe in the universe. Right. So
but then I guess the point is that if the metaphysical could go beyond the physical, why argue that something cannot come into existence out of nothing? So that's restrained to the physical, and the universe just came into existence out of nothing.
Because we have intuitions that would still move at least some of us to say, I think it's if I have to choose what's more plausible, the idea that out of nothing comes, or its negation, I would side with. So in other words, this is where these evidential lines come in to try to say, look, I think there's something to that idea. And overall, it's a plus for it that the empirical observation is in conformity. In other words, why think that it's a minus? Why think it's irrelevant. That's where I guess my
Yeah.
pressure would be on somebody who wants to say
Yeah.
it's irrelevant.
But I guess our
Yeah.
intuitions are physical because they're based on observing the physical things in our surroundings, right? And if we were to stick to those intuitions, then the very idea of
Yeah.
the universe even coming into existence sounds very unintuitive to me, regardless
Right.
of what the physicists or philosophers are going to say. And if
Yes.
someone wants to offer me a model of how the universe came into existence, that would be contrary to my intuitions. My intuition is telling me it must have always been there.
Yeah. And this is where I want to say precisely, so I don't want to constrain it to only what we observe in that rigid sense. Like, so I would just deny that that's the right way to go. But as far as us not being comfortable with some ideas that physicists are talking about, I guess at this point I want to say, look, empiricism at some level has to be embraced. Like senses, like what we see matters, what scientists talk about matters, and it should frame what it is that we think is possible or not. It should tell us, almost from the point that actuality presupposes possibility, that because it's actual, we have reasons to think it is actual from science. We must think it's possible metaphysically. Right. Or physically, indeed, because science deals with physics.
Right, but now none of these theories describing the universe coming into existence are actual. They're just theories. It's not that, we've risen here from actuality to possibility. Otherwise, we wouldn't have so many different completing models and theories, right?
What I mean is, there are observations that we have with respect to the actual universe that tell us what's true about its history, not what's possible or necessarily has to be the case, simply what seems to be true about it. And if you think that on the scientific grounds that it is true, like many physicists who adopt Big Bang cosmology, for example, that Big Bang is a unique event. Nobody has observed it. This is all going beyond what we are comfortable from the imaginistic point of view of picturing things. But I want to say, well, except what the physicists are saying. You know what I mean? Like, just if they have empirical reasons for that, kind of follow that. Allow, because it's not indeed, just because I also granted that imaginability isn't always a great guide to conceivability either. And ultimately, when you're talking about your intuition resisting some of these theories, are you not resisting it from the imaginability point of view, as opposed to conceivability? Because if you were presented with models that specify what it is that people are talking about and how coherent internally it is, maybe you'd go, oh, I can now conceive of it. And it's really just that I wasn't aware of this model in sufficient detail to know what it was that I was supposed to entertain as a possibility.
Right. So I guess one point to mention here is that supposedly none of these theories are guaranteed to be certain.
Correct. Absolutely.
It's a hypothesis, and as you rightly mentioned, since no one has observed the Big Bang, we can only
we infer it,
right? There might be competing theories that may offer a different explanation, and oftentimes in history, the theories that we held to be true in the past are no longer held to be true. There may be a new theory sometime later on, although our intuitions are usually stick with us a little longer than theories. I'm sure. Oh, Timo, I think you've frozen there for a second. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm back. I hope. Yeah, now I can hear you. Yeah, all good.
Okay, right. And I guess the second point about like the whole Big Bang thing and the physical theories suggesting that the universe must have come into existence at some point. I guess I'm not sure, maybe we'll touch upon that in the next episode when we talk about the different concepts of the universe and how they how can we can sort of equivocate between this and what we mean exactly by the universe. Do we mean matters? Do we mean matter and space and time and everything together, and whether these theories cover this? So I guess this is a separate topic.
But I think so. But that would be pertinent to whether the physical universe began to exist.
Exactly. So we can probably discuss that in connection with the second premise. But I'm thinking that in the interest of time, we should perhaps move on, unless you have something else to say on this point.
I will restrain myself.
Thank you.
By physical law, but by sheer pragmatics.
Thanks very much. So I think for today, we have one more point to discuss, which deals with physics again, interestingly, this time with quantum mechanics, which I
Start
confess,
next time.
which I confess I know very little about. So do you want to walk us through this objection briefly?
How about we do it next time, just for
You
the
think
sake of,
so?
we
Yeah.
can just start with that. Yeah.
Okay.
And
Okay.
then not feel pressure to.
Okay, that's
Together.
perfect then. So in that case, let's wrap up for today. So next time we'll deal with quantum mechanics as we've announced, and we will also look at the objections to the second premise of the argument. Is that right?
Yep,
So we sort of look
absolutely.
at these things in conjunction.
Yep.
Well, it remains for me to thank Dimer for all his wonderful contributions and the discussion today. It's been absolutely great. I really enjoyed
loved it. I loved it.
I hope our listeners and viewers enjoyed it as well. And we just look forward to seeing you very soon to discuss further objections to the Kalam argument. Thank you all very much and see you shortly. Bye now.
Bye.